All right, today we're doing something a little different. Instead of debating an issue, we're going to deconstruct an argument. We're taking a piece of political commentary and breaking it down step by step to see exactly how it builds its case about the conflict between politicians and law enforcement. So let's dive in.
Okay, so this right here, this is the central claim we're looking at. It's a huge, bold statement, and it's basically the thesis of the whole piece. Everything else we're about to see is designed to back this one idea up. So the real question is, how do they even try to prove it? So here's our roadmap for how we're going to break this down. We'll start with that central accusation itself. Then we'll get into the specific flashpoint in Minneapolis that kind of set this whole thing off. After that, we'll dig into the power of words, the specific language being used, and then explore the question of motive. From there, we'll see how the source connects this to a bigger pattern, and finally, we'll look at the final argument it makes. All right, first up, the central accusation. You know, before you can build any argument, you gotta lay a foundation. So let's unpack the core claim this whole thing rests on. So here's what the source is actually arguing. It's not just saying that these politicians disagree with law enforcement. The claim is way, way stronger. It's that they are actively inciting violence against federal agents, specifically ICE. See how that's a huge leap? It's not just disagreement, it's incitement. And that claim becomes the foundation for everything else that follows. Now, to back up a claim that big, you really need a catalyst, a specific event. And that brings us to our next section, the flashpoint in Minneapolis. The source uses this one incident as the main piece of evidence for its entire argument.
Okay, so the whole argument is anchored to this one specific incident, a confrontation between protesters and an ICE officer in Minneapolis that, tragically, ended in a fatal shooting. And as you can probably guess, an event like that sparked some immediate and very, very different reactions.
And this is really where the argument starts to take shape. You have two totally opposing narratives. On one side, you've got the administration's take. They called it an act of domestic terrorism and said the officer fired in self-defense. But then, look at how the source material interprets the mayor's response. It frames his condemnation as effectively calling the ICE agent a murderer. The entire argument really hinges on this specific framing of the mayor's words.
This clash of narratives leads us right into the argument's next big point. So, Section 3, the power of words. The focus now shifts away from the actual event on the ground and zooms in on the language used by public officials right after it happened.
So now the argument pivots to using direct quotes as its primary evidence. And the first one up is from Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey. The source presents this quote as Exhibit A, basically, proof of open hostility toward the federal agency at the center of the incident.
And to argue that this isn't just one mayor's opinion, the source brings in this second quote, this time from the state's governor. By highlighting that word Gestapo, the commentary is trying to establish what it sees as a pattern of really inflammatory, hostile rhetoric. And here is the crucial connection the source wants you to make. The argument is that this language isn't just, political talk. It's that these words have a direct, real-world impact. They claim it literally puts a target on the backs of immigration officers out on the streets.
Okay, so if that's the what, the argument naturally moves to the why, and that brings us to Section 4, a question of motive. Here, the commentary tries to explain the political thinking behind using such strong language.
The source then lays out what it claims are purely political motives. It suggests this is all a strategy, right? It's about looking good politically, catering to what it calls radical constituents, and even trying to change the subject from a local fraud investigation. The argument is basically that this is all a calculated political game, and that it even gives constituents a pass to believe agents deserve to be harassed. From there, the argument really starts to zoom out. In Section 5, connecting to a pattern, the source tries to frame this one incident not as a random event, but as just the latest chapter in an ongoing story of chaos. Now, this slide shows a really key rhetorical move the source makes. It builds a timeline that connects the 2020 riots in Minneapolis to the governor's Gestapo comment a few months ago, and then boom, to the current shooting incident. By laying it out like this, the argument is suggesting a direct, predictable line of escalation. And to try and make that connection between rhetoric and reality feel more real, more concrete, the source then lists off these specific violent acts. These are presented as the tangible, violent consequences of the political atmosphere it claims these Democratic leaders have created. And all of that brings us to the argument's grand finale, Section 6, the final argument.
This is where all the pieces we've looked at, the incident, the words, the motive, the pattern, they all get tied together into one final big conclusion. So, the ultimate conclusion the source presents is pretty stark. It concludes that this isn't an accident or some kind of mistake. It's a deliberate political strategy, and that these leaders are, in its words, perfectly fine with stoking chaos. But the argument doesn't just stop at a conclusion. It ends with a direct call to action. By speaking right to the voters of Minnesota, the commentary shifts gears from just analyzing the situation to actively trying to persuade, framing the whole thing as an issue for the ballot box. So there you have it. We've traced this entire argument from its initial bold accusation all the way to its final call to action. And breaking it down piece by piece like this really shows you how commentary can work to frame real-world events, which leaves us with a bigger question to think about. How does this kind of political commentary really shape our own perception of what's happening in the world?